All right, well, welcome everybody to our monthly virtual meetup for Salt Project. We're really excited about this one. We have had a lot of buzz lately about Kubernetes, and so we wanted to talk about that today. So I am your host, Janae Andrus, the Salt Community Manager, and we have a really cool panel today. It's a really particularly fantastic panel that I'm really excited about. So we're going to spend some time hearing from them on Kubernetes and how it intersects with Salt. And I think we're all really excited to hear their thoughts and pick their brains. So we have Tom Hatch, the creator of Salt, and so many things I can insert here. I'm just debating. Nick wanted me to out you for your love of triangle cut peanut butter sandwiches and long walks on the beach in circles. And and then, of course, we have Gareth Greenaway, who is one of our fantastic engineers for the Salt core team, one of our senior software engineers, and particularly excited about having him here and lending his insight. And we have Nick Hughes, who I'm just going to introduce you as our community champion, because that's the most important thing on your resume, obviously. Obviously. No, Nick has been a big part of our community and CEO of his own company, and really excited to have him here. He has a huge contribution to the Salt community. So we're excited for those who are here who can ask some questions. But for the most part, what we're going to be doing, we'll basically kick it off with one question that, to be honest, I fully anticipate taking the entire time. So Tom, Gareth, Nick, I would love your thoughts on where we're currently at with how Salt and Kubernetes interact, and more importantly, where you think we can go with it. What is the vision that you see of Salt and Kubernetes interacting together? And I think we'll just start with Nick, if you want to kick it off.
Perfect. Yeah, I'm the one who's unmuted, so I get to go first.
That's my decision-making process.
So I think it's worthwhile to talk about where we are right now. And so we had our first Kubernetes working group meeting just recently, and that was one of the main questions that we asked during that meeting was, how are people using Salt with Kubernetes? What are some of the different workflows that are out there currently? Because quite frankly, I think that we have a good opportunity in front of us right now to make some changes to how things currently are, and sort of push in a direction that we want to go for the future, right? Leading to the second part of your opening sentence. So where we currently are, I think that there's maybe a little bit of fragmentation in the code. There's some different modules there that I'm not quite sure why the separation. There's certainly some stuff surrounding kubeadm for the stand-up clusters, but there seems to be two other distinct modules for just interacting with the Kubernetes API. So we certainly want to consolidate those. And then Kubernetes is moving really fast, and I think that we as a community probably need to do a better job of keeping up with those changes, and that's part of the reason that the Kubernetes working group has stood up recently. Gareth and I were talking the other day about all of the current state of things, and we'd love for people to show up to the working group and meetups like this in order to give us some feedback on how things might be used currently, and maybe some visions for the future. What do you think of that, Gareth?
Yeah, no, definitely. I would agree with everything Nick just said. Dangerous words, I know. One of the unfortunate things with the current support in Salt for Kubernetes is we just haven't been able to keep up with the rapid pace of development, the features added and the API changes to Kubernetes. And so unfortunately, people go to use things and follow the documentation, follow the ways, like the how-tos and everything, and things just don't work currently. So that is one of our hopes from the working group, is to kind of to tighten that up and make it so that if you go to use a specific implementation in Salt related to Kubernetes, it does work. And that comes from like asking the community, like for both help as well as for development as well as testing. The other thing I wanted to add too, just kind of reiterating from our Nick and I, our conversation the other day, was one of the things I think that Salt brings to the Kubernetes table beyond just the usual stuff, the usual functionality of managing like a Kubernetes cluster, deploying pods or containers, services, is tying in Kubernetes and Kubernetes support into things like the Salt event bus. One of the things that I've demoed frequently is using like a little Raspberry Pi cluster, is having those events go onto the event bus, and doing simple stuff like turning on lights on like a little light panel. But that's just like a kind of scratching the surface of what you could do if you get those events onto the event bus. And then like the sky's the limit with stuff, like I said, stuff beyond just config management, tying it into our beacon support, our engine support, reactors, like all that good stuff. There's a huge breadth of possibilities of what you could do, like one with Salt and Kubernetes. Tom, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, so, and I guess one of the background things that I'd like to kind of present on is just that we go back in time, and I mean, Salt was the original platform used by Kubernetes for deployment. I mean, back in the early days of Kubernetes, before it was even released, some of the core Kubernetes team came out to Salt Lake to meet with us, to talk about ways to make the Kubernetes deployment smoother. And in the early days, right, is when most of a lot of that groundwork happened. But Kubernetes has evolved and Salt has evolved, and both of them have evolved kind of in different directions, but at the same time, there seems to be more ground now for them to coincide and work together. And we're experiencing a lot more demand to be able to have these things work together. And so one of the ironic things is that this kind of evolution is why we're in the position that we are now. Kubernetes has changed significantly since all of our original work on the platform was done. And we need to be able to come back and take a much more fresh and new look at just how everything needs to be laid out. And then I think that that being able to evaluate that is going to be something that should be really beneficial from a Salt perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. Tying back to what Gareth said about the event-driven workflows, the event bus is the most powerful thing about Salt, period, in my opinion, right? Like it's the thing that ties everything together, the thing that sets it apart from every other platform that I've used. And integrating that into Kubernetes workflows would be, a really powerful thing, from a lot of different perspectives. You could react to events outside of your Kubernetes cluster and take actions inside, and potentially vice versa. Using that platform to do crazy things is something that I'm really excited for. Once we get some functionality where those workflows can be built, doing things like continuous deployment operators inside of the Kubernetes cluster. I think all of those things are going to be possible with the event bus, and with some solid functionality built around Kubernetes API.
Have you all ever considered having a minion that runs inside a cluster, kind of like an operator style minion mode?
I think that you could certainly do something like that with an operator pattern, right? Whether or not you would have to be inside of the cluster, um, I think that's probably your prerogative, right? It really depends on how we leverage um, roles in RBAC within the Kubernetes cluster to allow it to interact with different parts of the API. Once we have the basic functionality, right? Like, getting different object types, performing different atomic operations, and then, more of the stateful side of it, deploying objects in a stateful way and ensuring that state. Once that core functionality is there, I think that, regardless of whether you're running Salt inside of the cluster or outside of the cluster, you could definitely do an operator pattern using the event bus as that core.
So the other answer I've got for that question is that I was recently working with another team inside of VMware who is actively working on deploying more components inside of operator patterns, and they're very interested in doing this. And so mostly they want to do it to expose a lot of the cloud functionality inside of Salt, as well as IDLE. And so that is something that we're probably going to be seeing, but I'm not making any promises as to dates yet. We're pretty early on there. But yeah, I'm seeing interest in being able to run a minion or at least Salt routines from an operator pattern, becoming more and more of a prevalent desire.
And that's why we invite Tom to these things, pulling back the curtain and getting the dirt behind the scenes, right?
This just happened to occur a couple of days ago.
Awesome. Yeah, and I think that gearing more towards the future and what things might look like, certainly that type of event-driven workflow is going to be the core of it. But I think it was Coleman that I had a discussion with about the Go templating that you see inside of like Helm charts and things like that. We're both not a fan, and leveraging Jinja inside of say a formula for deploying an app inside of Kubernetes would certainly be ideal, especially when you can leverage the execution modules from Salt in order to fill in a lot of those blanks. That's not something that you have really available to you inside of a Helm chart, and that's a really exciting workflow to think about. Reaching out into different parts of your infrastructure, pulling back information actively, and then throwing it inside of a templated chart, more or less, deploying that into Kubernetes. That's something that's really exciting, and I would love to see that templating be used, even though it's a pretty basic part of what Salt does and is. We're just going to get that for free by living inside of the framework once we build out the working execution state modules. And I think that's going to be a really cool thing to see how people are utilizing that in different ways.
Yeah, I mean, quite simply, I had experience with Salt a few years ago in a traditional non-Kubernetes environment. But I just needed something that wasn't scoped to a single cluster, right? Didn't assume that like you run your entire world inside of one giant cluster, which I think is kind of a problematic assumption that a lot of at least getting started guides with Kubernetes stuff assumes. And also something that interacts with like things that aren't Kubernetes, right? Because a lot of our customers, they also don't run things inside of one giant cluster. They have multiple clusters. They have other cloud resources. And, you need a framework. And so there still isn't a Kubernetes. I mean, would you even want a Kubernetes centric framework for doing something like that? And I guess my opinion is no. So I wanted something more like Salt where I could reach out into multiple clusters, VMs, other things that aren't, you know, aren't like a scope to a single cluster. There's just not that many opinions there. So in other environments, I've just ended up writing a ton of bash, right? So I'm basically back to 2005.
Yeah, so, and what you're describing is something that we're hearing more and more and more of. For a long time, the Kubernetes world has been very energetic around an idea that Kubernetes is going to be an all-consuming thing, but this is a very rare phenomenon in the history of the world, that one philosophy or idea becomes all-consuming. We as humans keep trying, but it just doesn't pan out. And so, I mean, I've been beating the drum for a while that heterogeneous and hybrid style environment is something we're going to be seeing more and more of. Because there's always going to be situations where you've either got a combination of legacy resources with using Kubernetes for the areas which I'm generally going to argue it's best at, which is compute balancing. With the fact that there are a number of different scenarios where all these different types of resources scale very differently than what we see inside of Kubernetes. Being able to combine those different resources in effective ways is what I think the automation needs of the next generation are. And I think the Salt can play a very critical role in there. But that also means that we need to rethink some of the models that we've been using around larger scale automation, which again is why I'm trying to beat on a few different doors, as I feel like we've kind of constantly got this big spectrum that we're dealing with. And one of those is trying to explore what we need to create truly high-level automation over these extremely heterogeneous deployments. And there's a lot of questions as to what does that need to look like? Because there's so many different automation models that are out there. And Kubernetes has pioneered a lot when it comes to distributed declarative state. And there's a lot to learn from it. But at the same time, when we kind of step back, there are still some models that I think that Salt has done a really good job of defining that are still going to be very true in the world moving forward, where the nature of your infrastructure can't always be abstracted to purely declarative state. And that there is always going to be a need to be able to deal with all of these arbitrary external resources. And that I'll quote Linus Torvalds when he said, "I sure hope that Linux isn't the last kernel that gets used." There's always room for new models and new expressions. And the hope is that as we move forward, we can figure out how to make those things smoother. But yeah, in the end, I do think that the core idea behind Salt, which is that compute resources need to be abstracted into three things, and that is declarative state, flow, and event. I think that's still true for distributed environments today, with or without Kube.
I'll just build on kind of what Tom was saying there very briefly, because that was very eloquently put.
Don't kiss up to him.
Well, I mean, I don't have to anymore.
I sold my right to fire Gareth.
That's right. That was the biggest, boldest part in the merger contract or the acquisition was Tom can no longer fire Gareth. No, I was gonna say, like, I think Kubernetes, like, it's a great solution, but it's not the ultimate solution. And oftentimes it is kind of pegged as, which is kind of the classic tech problem, like something new and shiny comes along and everyone thinks like, oh, this is the silver bullet that will solve all of my problems. There's a classic meme that goes around every once in a while that shows a person that wants to deploy a website, and there's this cartoon huge truck with all the different pieces that you need to kind of deploy a Kubernetes cluster, and they're just looking at the truck like, all I want to do is a simple blog for my website. But it's easy to get like kind of like caught up in the like, oh, well, I should be running this in Kubernetes because like that's the thing, that's what we're doing. But one of the nice things about Salt is it is possible to run it and use it with Kubernetes, but also all of the other stuff that's out there. Like you wouldn't necessarily want to run your database servers, in my opinion, only in like a Kubernetes cluster, or in Docker or something like that. And so like you can use Salt to manage those. And so like being able to kind of use the same tool to manage different parts of your infrastructure is very powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree with that. And you know, I would also, you made the point of saying my opinion only with the database thing. I'll lump onto that. I'm not a big database and Kubernetes guy. You know, I think that sometimes it makes sense, but you know, other times maybe less so. But you know, I would agree that I think that there's going to be a lot of different you know, components to your infrastructure always, you know, and to say that, you know, we're going to run every single part of what we do inside of or even outside of Kubernetes without any regard to what the best tool for the job might be, is probably not in anyone's best interest.
Also, I think my opinion is declarative can't live at the highest level, right? You need imperative, like if this, then that capability at the highest level, because, and I think that's why you see another class of tools like Clutch from Lyft and Backstage from Spotify. Like they're basically Jenkins 3.0, you know, like APIs that you can like call and then it'll go and do stuff. And they give you some, like, they give you a framework for that, but like, you know, you can't, it's too brittle to try and like shove everything into like that single declarative declaration. Layers is the right approach. I think that, you know, traditional configuration management frameworks kind of figured that out. You know, you had your Nginx template, you templated it, and then you could like orchestrate it at progressively higher levels into larger things. And there's no reason that you can't do the same with Kubernetes deployments.
Right, and that goes right back into you know, the argument that I've been making for the last 10 years, is that you have to have a combination of declarative and imperative. You've got to be able to interface with systems on both levels, and that declarative state is able to solve a massive percentage of your problems and make a huge amount of your problems go away. But there's always going to be a variable percentage of those problems which still require imperative interaction. And that imperative interaction needs also to be tied to events that are not necessarily driven by the user, right? The events that naturally occur inside of an infrastructure based on just its normal operation. And that as we try so hard, and have tried so hard since Mark Burgess came out with CF Engine and his original paper on declarative state and computing back in 1994. Somebody's going to call me on that. It might be 93. Mark Burgess is so awesome, such a cool guy. But I mean, and even before that, we've tried to ram computing into declarative state. And I'm a big fan of looking in the mirror and being honest with myself and saying, hey, Tom, you're a little fat, but that's okay. and I can work with that, right? Hey, Tom, you got these problems and that's okay. And I can work with that instead of looking in the mirror and saying, I'm going to have anorexia because I have to have what I think is some fake perfection. And I think that's what we're trying to do by trying to ram everything into declarative state, instead of being able to, hey, accept the fact that this is how crap works, guys. Let's deal with what's out there.
So I have a question that I think I'd like some Tom input on. Um, I can see your face, Tom. So a buddy of mine a few months ago brought up Cluster API to me, and really his whole question was, if we have Cluster API and that's what builds our clusters on top of like cloud platforms or other things that Cluster API supports, at that point, all you really need is something to be able to deploy that declarative state of your cluster itself. And so his question to me was, how do you see Salt tying into Cluster API and enabling it, or does Cluster API obviate Salt in that capacity if you're using it? Like, how do they fit together?
So we come back and look at something like Cluster API. This is, this is still effectively automation inside of Kubernetes. And it is still effectively the continuation of trying to create higher levels of declarative abstraction, which is, again, I'm going to argue, a noble pursuit. But I'm going to come back and say that it's the same construct as before. It still makes sense, I think, to be able to allow something like a Salt to act as a bridge between a Kubernetes and external applications. And I see that as being one of the heaviest and most powerful things that we can do from a Salt perspective, is being that bridge inside of a heterogeneous environment, as opposed to assuming that Kubernetes is going to maintain a completely homogeneous system. And the other thing is that when we look at something like Cluster API, it's just an API that probably is going to make the next generation of what we can do with Salt integration into Kubernetes even easier. There's always going to be questions about where you're managing what components. And the goal of Salt has always been a glue tool to make it easy to glue together a lot of different disparate systems and components, to be able to take and normalize information from different systems so that we can automate across different systems in a unified way. And so I would still maintain that that's the fundamental difference between Kubernetes and the automation constructs inside of Kubernetes. That those automation constructs strive to work inside of that box. And that Salt is made to bring together multiple boxes. And that so long as we need to bring together multiple boxes, there will be a place for Salt, which I feel really safe in saying that that problem is not going to go away. It certainly hasn't gone away in the last 6 years of Kubernetes hype. And so I don't think it's going to go away in the next 5-10 years of Kubernetes hype. At the same time, yes, I think that the approach of the problem of normalizing and communicating between disparate arbitrary components and systems and automating disparate and arbitrary components and systems is something that we need to continue to evolve and cycle on, which is, again, where a lot of what I'm trying to do right now is. But I don't think that the continued evolution of Kubernetes is going to fundamentally negate the need for accepting the fact that there are more systems out there than what you can fit inside of a kube.
It's a great answer. And I can tell him that I asked his question now.
And that's what matters. Question, man. I threw it in Tom's face. Just chill.
I told him to show up, but he didn't. So yeah, I guess I can throw him under the bus for that now, huh?
It's always nice to throw somebody under the bus.
You can send him this recording and make sure he watches this part. So I do want to take a second to plug the working group that Nick mentioned earlier. So we do have a Kubernetes working group within the SALT project, and those meetings are posted on saltproject.io. So you can go there to become part of the working group if you want to get more involved in all of these things. Gareth, Tom, and Nick, what are your thoughts around the working group and what you're hoping that maybe that specifically will accomplish? And then also I want to let those of you who have joined know that we're kind of doing an open mic forum. So if you do have a question, feel free to unmute and chime in at any point.
Well, Gareth, she said your name first, so go for it.
Alphabetical order. There's a method to the madness.
Yeah, so I think my one, I mean, I have a few different ideas of what I'm hoping that the working group gives us. But one of the biggest one I think is answering that question that I leaded with at the start was what people want to do with Kubernetes and Salt, how they see Kubernetes and Salt fitting together. What the use case is there, like what people are looking to get out of it. If it's simply like deploying a cluster, a Kubernetes cluster, deploying multiple Kubernetes clusters, or if they're looking to, as Coleman alluded to, kind of running Salt within a cluster, or simply just like controlling a cluster. That's to me the unanswered question right now. And maybe it's all three. Maybe the answer is like people want to be able to do all three. But I think that's kind of part of the reason why the support within Salt for Kubernetes is kind of hasn't caught up, is because people, when it was originally written, when it was added to Salt, the person that persons that added it had a particular use case. But I think that the use case of Kubernetes and the use cases of Salt has kind of grown beyond that original use case. So yeah, that's the biggest question I'm looking to get answered from the working group, is just what people want the Salt and Kubernetes to, like, how they want them to interact, to fit together.
Absolutely. I think that getting input from the community is job number one. And after our first meeting, that was pretty much the takeaway there was, we need people to tell us how they're using it, attempting to use it, or want to use it, so that we can drive in the correct direction. Because this really is a community. It's not the Gareth, Nick, or even the Tom show. This is a group effort, and we're all building something together that hopefully gets a lot of use for all. And for me personally, Gareth sort of alluded to it in the sense that he said that somebody had a certain use case in mind when they contributed the existing code. I really want to streamline that based upon, certainly input that we take at the beginning of all this. But, I think that given my personal workflows inside of Kubernetes, a lot of the existing states just don't make a lot of sense to me, right? Like I end up wrapping YAML or distinct files with another YAML wrapper, and it just, I don't see the point in that particular workflow for me. What I really need out of the tool is I need all of the execution module functionality to be on point, right? Like obviously all the gets and lists and all of the other fact finding information, and then the underlying creates and deletes that the present and absent would utilize in the state modules. Obviously all that's got to work. But from a state perspective, all I need is like, hey, I'm going to point this at a directory of stuff, and I either want you to deploy it or I want you to template it and deploy it. And I shouldn't have to call out like, hey, here's my deployment YAML. This is my service YAML. This is my ingress YAML individually. That's not a workflow that's inside of any other tool. And I think that we need to consolidate a lot of what's there in order to make a cleaner workflow, I think is probably the best way to put it. So I definitely want to see that. And then, I want to manage all the things, right? To Gareth's point, what in particular do you want to do? Man, I want to do everything. I want to create my clusters. I want to manage my clusters. I want to deploy things inside of my clusters. I want to get data out of my clusters and put it other places. The wonderful thing about Salt is that it's my Swiss Army knife, right? It allows me to do so many things. It's super flexible. So if I have all of those tools in my tool belt, then I'm going to be a pretty dangerous guy.
And that's what we want. We want Nick Hughes to be dangerous, deeply, deeply dangerous. No, the one thing I did want to say is that thank goodness it's not the Tom show anymore. And so I mean, when you start an open source project, the name is Hughes, Nick Hughes. Thank you, Randy. Excellent little comment in the chat there. Randy's always good for a joke. When you start an open source project, it does have to be the founder show. And I did that for a long time until I ended up in a hospital. And the reality here is that the best way for a community to function is for it to be something that operates with the input and collaboration of a lot of different people. And I'm incredibly glad that Salt has evolved to that point, so that we're not in a position where it needs to be the Tom show anymore. Because frankly, that means I get to sleep. But more importantly, it means that the way in which ideas are able to evolve can be significantly better. We need to be able to have a lot of discussion around what these APIs and states need to look like, so that we can abstract Kubernetes in really an optimal way, but also do it in a way that hopefully can grow with Kubernetes.
Oh, that's fantastic. I really appreciate you guys sharing your thoughts on where we're at. It sounds like there's a lot of opportunity to reach the vision we talked about of moving forward and seeing all the different ways and intersections that there are with Salt and Kubernetes. We do have a little bit of time if anyone would like to chime in with either a question or a use case or something that they've experienced in using Kubernetes with Salt, something that they would like to be able to do. We have quite a few people who have joined as we've been talking. If you'd like to chime in, feel free. Be happy to hear from you.
I have a question that's a little bit technical. The state of like the Python client library, is there any risk with that? I haven't really programmed with like client libraries a lot, but my impression is that the Go one is like really the blessed one, and that every other library is kind of like in some stage of catch up. So maybe if anyone knows anything about the Kubernetes client library, maybe they could give their opinion on that.
So I looked at it briefly the other day, and it seems like we are using the official Kubernetes Python client, which is good that it's in some state of maintainability. But you're absolutely right? Like, why do you think that most Kubernetes tools are written in Go? It's just because they have access to that library, and they can do the newest things the fastest. But I think that there's ways to write things in a flexible way that, you know, we should be able to just upgrade the client package as we go underneath, and, you know, things will more or less work, hopefully.
And it's one of those things I was thinking about when Nick asked his question about cluster API. As much, I mean, there's pluses and minuses to relying on like an external library or tool or whatever. But for something like this, if someone else can be responsible for and well, be responsible for like keeping up to date with changes to the Kubernetes API, and we can just hook into and use something like cluster API or whatever other tools are out there. To me, that's a big win. Like I said, there's pluses and minuses. Like the minus would be like, then you're relying on their upkeep and their maintainability. But if it's a project that looks like it's sustainable and will be around for the foreseeable future, then it's a win-win to me.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much. We really appreciated having our awesome panel. I couldn't think of a better team to talk about this topic with. Tom, Nick, and Gareth, really appreciate you guys. And of course, if anybody wants to get involved in the working groups, you can always go to saltproject.io, and there's a tab at the top that will take you straight to a page all about the working groups. You can get more involved with what we're doing with Kubernetes and improving that and getting to that vision that we talked about. So thanks everyone so much for being here. Hope you have a great rest of your day. Appreciate it. Thanks again, Nick, Gareth, and Tom. Have a good one.
Thank you.